I think for me, one of the most interesting aspects of being a longtime video game fan is following a series and watching it change and grow over time. The other day, I was talking to my roommate who was playing Atelier on their Steam Deck, and I realized that I had never really played an Atelier game. I mean, not technically. See, there was one particular GameStop that I used to go to when I was in high school. It was a little bit more expensive than the local secondhand stores, but always had much bigger variety of titles. I used to browse the secondhand PS2 games endlessly. Back then, I don't think I had anything more complex than a Nokia brick phone, so there was really no way to look up the reviews. I relied mostly on flashy cover art and interesting blurbs on the back of the box, and more often than not, things that heavily featured anime-style graphics or characters and designs usually tended to draw my eye the most. This is where I first came upon Marie+Ellie, Alchemist of El Revis. I was absolutely fascinated with this game for a time, so I thought to try and find other games by the same company, Gust. This is when I became vaguely aware that Marie+Ellie was part of a much bigger series, which brings us back around to Atelier. The first two games in the Atelier series, Atelier Marie and Atelier Ellie. Just for clarity's sake, I actually played a PS2 port of the first two games that was released exclusively in Japan. And in looking at the difference between the two versions, it's really just that the PS2 port has a little bit of cleaned up graphics and the menus look more in line with contemporary Atelier games at the time. Though Atelier is a series that spans many titles now, generally speaking, they are organized into sub-series that are named after what area they take place in, with games in those individual sub-series generally being spiritual successors to each other, separated by a length of time, but taking place in the same region. Similar to how the Fire Emblem games are sometimes categorized by the world they take place in. So for the first three games in the series, for instance, they are part of the Salberg sub-series because they all take place in the world of Salberg. More specifically, with these two games that we're covering, the first game takes place in the earliest point in the timeline, and the second game takes place like 5 or 10 years afterwards. One of the things I noticed very quickly as I played this game is I really like the aesthetics of it. It's not doing anything particularly special with the graphics, it's pretty standard anime fare, but the cozy vibe of the small village and the pastoral setting really resonated with me. It's nice. The character portraits have been smoothed out in this specific release, but there's a lot of jagged pixelated edge to them that overall gives them a cool PC-98 feel. The central premise is pretty basic. You control a cute anime girl, either Marie or Ellie respectively, and you have a time limit to complete a variety of objectives that will produce different endings when that time limit is completed. And I think this is the first most interesting thing that these early games in the series do. Instead of being a story-driven experience like Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest of its day, the flow of the game is much more in line with something like a dating sim. You're given 5 years of in-game time to complete the objective of essentially becoming a better alchemist. But what you do during that time and how you go about getting to be a better alchemist is completely up to you. It's a format that feels both freeing and a little overwhelming to start out. Managing time is an important mechanic, but it also is surprisingly forgiving within the game. The fact that you have 5 years gives you plenty of time to learn the mechanics of the game and spin your wheels a little bit before you really feel like you're in the groove. The other system, arguably the most defining system of the game, and indeed the big draw of the series as a whole, is the alchemy system, which is both simple and accessible even in this early incarnation. You start out with very basic knowledge of being able to only make very simple base materials that will be the building blocks of later items. Every recipe has an ingredient requirement, an amount of time that it takes to make it, and a percentage chance of completing it. As you make more and more items, your knowledge stat increases, which is the main factor in how likely you are to be able to create something successfully. Though there are other small factors that play into it as well, like whether or not your room is messy, what your fatigue level is, and if you have been previously successful in making an item or not. You can gain new recipes by buying textbooks in the academy, and then later, as your knowledge stat increases, you'll get access to the library in the academy, which allows you to read recipes straight out of library books. But what do you do with all these items, you might well ask? You're not just making them so you can make more items. The other big driving factor in this is the economy of the game. At the bar, you can take on requests that ask for specific materials or items and give you an amount of time with which to complete them in exchange for more gold. Money can also be used to buy specific materials, equipment for your workshop, and more textbooks from the store in the academy, but also it can be used to buy more equipment to outfit your characters, because in addition to being what's essentially an alchemy life simulator, this game is also a JRPG. The battle system in this game follows fairly typical JRPG fare. You have a party made up of 3 characters, including your main character and 2 bodyguards. During combat sequences, you basically position your characters in one of 3 slots in 3 rows, one for each character, and take turns attacking each other. Every bodyguard that you have has a unique special ability based on what weapon they use, with your main character not having any special ability at all. An interesting, slightly unique twist on this format is that in order to use items during battle, you have to equip them beforehand. A lot of these are items that you'll be able to create using alchemy. In order to use specific single-use items, you will also have to pay an MP cost. And while most of your bodyguards have fairly low MP maximums, your main character has a very high one. What this means functionally is that usually your bodyguards will be using either regular standard attacks or special abilities, and your alchemist is in charge of using items to either heal or damage the enemies. All of this makes for a fairly cozy gameplay loop where you're spending most of your time crafting, gathering materials, making things for yourself, or fulfilling requests. But I'm sure the big question is what does this all add up to? Like I said, there isn't really an overarching narrative, basically just a framing device for why you are where you are and what your overarching goal is for the end of the allotted time period. Throughout the game, there are timed events that will pop up if you're in town at a certain time or in your workshop on specific days. You can have special NPC interactions. But the biggest story-specific thing that happens at some point is that your best friend will get deathly sick and you'll have to make medicine for her. But even that isn't really a requirement, it's just a deciding factor in whether she continues being a part of the town events or not, and whether or not she's in the ending. What this all adds up to is a very player-centric, choice-driven experience that's very open for its time. You get to choose what you focus on. Do you follow rumors that there's a demon king living on an old tower? Do you focus on being a master alchemist, increasing your knowledge to the maximum? Or you can literally just sleep through the entirety of the game and learn nothing. All of them are legitimate ways to play the game. Having an open-ended, non-linear experience is something that's become more and more common as we've gone longer and longer with video games, but at the time, this would hardly be an established thing, and really an experience that you would only see in very specific JRPG series, something like the Saga series, or even the non-linearity in small bits in Zelda games and things like that. One of the things that I particularly appreciate about what's added to the PS2 port is after your first playthrough, you get a list of endings and the requirements to get them. And since this is such a small game with a set time limit, it feels like a full playthrough goes by really quickly. All told, my playthrough of the first game only took about 5.5 hours to complete. If you are the kind of person that wanted to go full completionist or just playing through the same game over and over again, or really enjoyed the cozy vibe of the game, that was your specific gamer interest, then it seems like it would be really engaging and fun to go back and play through with different ending goals in mind. For the majority of this review, I've been talking about the two games interchangeably, and that's because for the most part they are. While there are small mechanical changes that are made to the second one, I didn't find that they were so much that it necessarily made much of a difference in terms of how the game is played. In general, in the second game, the combat is a lot easier. Some of the bodyguards that you have access to in the very beginning of the game are much stronger than the bodyguards that you have access into the very beginning of the game in the first one. Another interesting quirk that I noticed in the second game is while all of the bodyguards that you can hire have unique special attacks this time around, they're not just dictated by what weapon they're using. They are all almost universally stronger than their standard attack, and since special attacks don't cost MP to use, I never really found a situation where it was better to use a normal attack over a special attack. Whereas in the first one, special attacks usually did a certain effect, but they were weaker than your standard attacks. Oddly enough, I think the first game actually plays a little bit better than the second does, although it's maybe not as forgiving in terms of difficulty, especially in the early game. I felt like the first one was very difficult in terms of combat difficulty and the ability to support yourself and get money. I still think it's a more enjoyable experience than the second one. At least that's the way it was for me. Overall, I'm really interested to see where this series goes as a franchise from this point. I know that when the Iris series started in the PS2 era, the games tend towards a more standard JRPG format with alchemy elements, and obviously I've played Monokemia, although it's been a long time now, and from what I remember, that functions more like this early game, but also puts a larger focus on an overarching plot. Hi everybody. Thanks for joining me again on this video. I know it's been a long time since my last one. I've been pretty busy in my personal life and just had a lot of things going on and not a lot of brain space to make videos in the past year or so. I've had a lot of aborted attempts and just ideas that really never came to fruition. I'm excited to be back making videos though. This is something that I really genuinely enjoy doing. As always, if you like what you see here, you can, leave a comment, ring the bell if you want to see more videos from me. I appreciate you always taking the time to watch these videos. I hope you're doing well and that you have a lovely day. Good night.